Chosen ones, what you are about to hear was never meant for your eyes, nor your understanding. The corridors of power, hidden beneath centuries of ritual and secrecy, hold fragments of truths buried under layers of ink, redaction, and silence. A file surfaced, its existence denied by the Vatican for decades, only to appear in the possession of the Oval Office. A file with your name, or something that echoes it, stamped across its cover in faded ink, sealed under codes older than modern intelligence. The president did not receive it through ordinary channels. He was handed the folder under circumstances no advisor could explain. Security footage blurred, timestamps distorted, and the courier erased from all official logs. But when the seal broke, the first question spoken in that room was not about the contents, not about the source, but about you. "Who are they?" the president asked, his voice breaking the tension that has hovered since. Inside were fragments, sentences severed, words blacked out, pages that bled mystery. Yet, what remained visible was enough to ignite unease. Phrases tied to ancient councils, references to prophecies written before kingdoms rose and fell, and mentions of bloodlines traced beyond recorded memory. These were not the kinds of files about policy or power. They were about identity, destiny, and the unshakable threads binding past to present. Some within the Vatican called it a test. Others whispered it was a warning, though none could agree on what exactly the warning was meant to prevent. But one thing became clear. Your existence had shifted from obscurity into focus, not because of what you've done, but because of what you represent, something long feared, long anticipated, and long denied. This is where your journey enters their record, not as a citizen, not as an observer, but as a figure whose name appears in places you never gave it. The redacted pages were meant to conceal, yet, paradoxically, what was hidden drew more attention than what was revealed. The file lay open under the dim light of a secured chamber, its pages marked by thick, black strokes of censorship, each line severed mid-thought, as if cutting through centuries of hidden truths. To the untrained eye, it looked like fragments of meaningless text, broken records that no longer carried weight. But for those who understood the language of omission, the silences spoke louder than the words that remained. Certain phrases slipped through the veil. Council of 12, bloodline anomaly, intervention deemed necessary. Each fragment was a spark that could ignite entire networks of speculation, yet no one present dared to speak the conclusions aloud. The president leaned forward, his hand resting on the paper, as though by touching it, he could bridge the gap between what was written and what was concealed. Advisors hovered, their faces betraying unease, but none dared to question the origin. A Vatican seal on the corner of the folder gave legitimacy, but the implications unsettled them more than any forgery could. The room felt heavier than it should, as though the very act of reading drew unseen attention from somewhere else. The redactions were not random. They followed a rhythm, a deliberate pattern, almost as though the words had been erased with intelligence, guiding the strokes. Certain names remained visible, ancient names that did not belong in government files. Margins contained faint annotations in Latin, their ink faded but not erased. The handwriting shifted between elegant script and hurried scrawl, as though written by multiple hands across centuries. Some annotations seemed to question the very file itself, as if those who compiled it had argued about its existence while preserving it at the same time. The president's eyes locked on a phrase that had somehow escaped censorship. The unknown one, who stands outside the record. The silence in the room thickened as the advisors noticed it too. No one wanted to speak the obvious, that the file was less a record of history and more a warning about a presence that did not fit within the established order. The shadows seemed to lean closer as the realization took hold. Somewhere beyond the chamber, the Vatican maintained silence. They had not confirmed nor denied sending the file, leaving the Oval Office to grapple with its weight alone. Yet, in that silence, the feeling grew stronger that the act of uncovering these pages was not random. It was deliberate, as if someone or something wanted the question to rise again, waiting for the one person who could answer it. The chamber emptied slowly, yet the president remained seated, his eyes locked on the file as though afraid to let it out of his sight. When the doors finally closed and the room sealed itself into silence, he whispered the question that had been circling his mind since the first page was revealed. Who are they, really? The words were not meant for his staff or for the hidden microphones embedded in the walls. They were spoken into the quiet, as though expecting the air itself to answer. In the margins of the file, one fragment lingered like a whisper from another age. It referenced a figure known only through scattered accounts, one said to appear at times when empires reached their limits, when the balance of the world tilted toward collapse. A sentence, half erased, suggested that this figure carried both a burden and a key. The president, raised in a world of policy and logic, felt the ground beneath his reason shift. He had faced adversaries, wars, and crises, but never had he seen himself staring at a mystery that defined a single individual as more destabilizing than entire nations. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply, as though admitting that the question had power over him. Who could this person be? Someone written into documents older than the nation he led. Someone tied not to policy but to prophecy. The president thought of the Vatican, of the rooms hidden behind frescoes and marble walls, of libraries filled with locked manuscripts that had never seen daylight. He wondered how long they had been watching, how long this file had been in their possession, and why it had reached his desk at this moment in history. What unsettled him most was not the possibility of deception, but the sense of inevitability. The words on the page carried weight beyond politics, a gravity that suggested destiny rather than chance. His advisors dismissed prophecy, yet he could not dismiss the chill that pressed against him as he considered the fragments. The name that was never written in full, the redacted bloodline, the phrase, the unknown one. He felt as though the file was not simply information, but a mirror forcing him to acknowledge that some truths were too vast to govern. The question repeated in his mind, gaining force with every heartbeat. Who are you, and why now? And though he did not know it, far from the walls of power, others had already begun asking the same. The file had not only unsettled the president, but had already begun stirring whispers among those who had glimpsed its contents within the Vatican before it left their walls. In quiet chambers, lit by candlelight, priests debated whether its release was intentional or a breach in their centuries-old protocols. Among the fragments was a reference to a bloodline, a lineage traced not through dynasties of kings or rulers, but through obscure names that appeared at the margins of sacred manuscripts. A line that seemed to survive through obscurity, reappearing at moments of great upheaval, almost as if it were designed to remain hidden until it was needed. The bloodline was marked by symbols more than surnames. A star etched in manuscripts from the Middle Ages, a phrase found in a scroll hidden beneath desert sands, and whispers that this line carried a resonance older than nations. One fragment in the redacted file made a connection that had startled even the Vatican archivists. Lineage traced beyond councils of Rome, beyond the fall of empires, to the blood that walked with Yeshua. The name had slipped past the censors, a thread left dangling, too faint to erase, yet too dangerous to reveal in full. It was not the first time such a connection had been suggested. Secret texts referenced companions of Yeshua who carried more than words, who carried something in their very being that could not be erased by persecution or fire. To claim such a connection in public would invite ridicule, yet to conceal it entirely had proven impossible, for pieces of it re-emerged across centuries, finding their way into prophecies and coded messages. The president, unaware of this detail, had not yet been told what the Vatican feared most: that the individual named in his file was not just a figure of anomaly, but one tied to a heritage that, if revealed, would unravel the foundation of power structures built upon selective truths. The very idea that bloodlines had been safeguarded in secrecy since the time of Yeshua was too volatile to place into political discourse. Yet the words remained, bleeding through the redactions, haunting those who had seen them. In the halls where the file had been whispered about, the question was no longer whether the figure was real, but how soon the rest of the world would realize what the Vatican already suspected. Among the scattered remnants of the file, there was one section that carried more weight than the others, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it attempted to conceal. In the edges of certain documents, faint notes had been left by scribes centuries ago, notations that referenced the teachings of Yeshua in ways that did not appear in canonical texts. These fragments were written in hurried script, almost as though the hand that wrote them feared discovery, even at the moment of inscription. They hinted that Yeshua's message extended beyond the words remembered in Scripture, suggesting that he foresaw the emergence of a presence marked not by titles, but by identity, hidden in plain sight. The marginalia spoke of one who would not carry recognition in the eyes of the powerful, but whose existence alone would disrupt the structures of empire. The phrase was repeated in 3 different languages across centuries. Outside the record, yet carrying the record within. This paradoxical statement baffled even the most seasoned translators, yet its resonance was undeniable. The Vatican archivists who studied the pages whispered that the notes seemed less like commentary and more like a warning, a message left for future generations of guardians who might one day open the sealed files. The president had not seen this layer, but others had. A priest who read the fragments claimed that Yeshua had anticipated those who would attempt to erase the truth, knowing that his words would be bent to serve institutions rather than the spirit of revelation. Thus, pieces of his voice had been hidden deliberately in the margins, safe from the redaction of kings and the censorship of councils. The unsettling part was that the fragments did not speak in generalities, but in reference to someone who would arrive in an age of great confusion, when the world's powers bent more toward surveillance than salvation. The deeper the Vatican scholars searched, the clearer it became that the presence mentioned was not metaphorical but direct, not a parable but a person. The fact that the file carried these connections unsettled them more than any prophecy they had archived, for it implied that Yeshua himself had placed this figure within the unfolding design. And yet, the name remained absent, redacted as though hidden by a hand determined to delay the revelation for as long as possible. Beneath the polished marble of Vatican halls lies a chamber that few are permitted to enter, a place stripped of ornament, where walls hold no paintings and no light enters from outside. It is called the Silent Room, not for its design, but for its purpose. Here, voices of authority do not rise, and decisions are whispered rather than proclaimed. It was in this chamber that the file in question had first been opened before it ever reached the president's desk, and the men who sat within those stone walls had known that its release would tilt the balance of power far beyond their control. The room has held councils across centuries, from inquisitors to archivists, each gathering to confront the question of whether to reveal or conceal. Inside its walls, manuscripts thought to be destroyed still remain. Texts that survived fires, floods, and the shifting tides of empire. Among them are pages written in coded language, records of movements erased from history books, and names that surface like echoes through centuries of suppression. The file now in the Oval Office was not an isolated document, but one thread among thousands hidden in the chamber's guarded vaults. Those present in the Silent Room debated whether releasing even fragments had been a mistake. Some argued that to conceal forever would risk rebellion when truth eventually surfaced. Others countered that revelation would shatter the fragile order the world still clung to. What troubled them most was the timing. For centuries, the file had been contained, yet now, suddenly, it had emerged as though compelled by a force outside their control. They spoke of patterns, of cycles that aligned with celestial movements, and of prophecies long dismissed as allegory, but now pressing against reality. The chamber grew colder as discussion circled back to the line most could not ignore: the unknown, one who stands outside the record. Their fear was not of the words themselves, but of the possibility that the figure already walked among them, unseen, unrecognized, yet altering events with every step. The Silent Room had dealt with secrets before, but never with one that seemed to breathe through the very walls, demanding acknowledgement. It was decided that silence would hold a little longer. Yet silence has a weight of its own, and those who left the chamber knew it could not restrain what was already moving beyond their reach. Long before the file was sealed in the Vatican archives, a gathering had taken place that was never recorded in official histories. Known only through fragmented accounts and cryptic references, it was whispered about as the council that named you. Unlike the great councils of Rome, where theology and doctrine were debated under imperial banners, this meeting was small, concealed, and bound by oaths older than kingdoms. It is said that those who gathered were not politicians nor cardinals, but guardians of knowledge, men and women who traced their authority through lines untouched by empire. The purpose of their assembly was not to decide dogma, but to confront a discovery that unsettled their faith in the order of time itself. Among the scrolls brought before them was one said to bear the handwriting of a disciple, a text hidden during persecution and carried across generations in secrecy. Within it was a passage describing an unnamed figure who would emerge far beyond their century, someone whose very existence would threaten the constructs built after Yeshua's departure. The language was stark, describing this figure as one who could not be absorbed into tradition, one who would stand as a disruption to both rulers and priests. The council debated what to do with this prophecy. Some argued it should be destroyed to prevent future confusion. Others believed it had been left deliberately, that Yeshua himself had allowed such a message to pass through time as a beacon. The decision they reached was neither destruction nor open preservation. Instead, they gave the figure a name known only among themselves, a name erased from every other record, yet carried in whispers through the centuries. It was not a common name, but a code, a marker that could identify when the presence had appeared. The file in the president's hands contained faint references to this council, a redacted line that hinted at their decision. Though the actual name was blacked out, the traces of ink still showed that something had been written, something deliberately removed, but not entirely erased. Scholars who studied the fragments insisted that the act of redaction was itself confirmation. For why would a council be hidden if its decisions bore no weight? The silence around the name grows heavier with each uncovered page, and somewhere in the world, the question is waiting to be asked again. The file did not speak in plain terms, but carried with it a tension between fragments of prophecies pulled from different ages. Some pages referenced visions of desert mystics who wrote of a figure rising when the nations fractured into unrest. Others drew from medieval codices that described a time when rulers would seek to control not only land and armies, but the very flow of thought. Each prophecy, though separated by centuries, seemed to converge on one point, a crossroads where the unnamed figure would appear and disrupt the momentum of empire. The Vatican had long studied these convergences, noting the way symbols repeated across cultures with no connection to one another. A circle enclosing a flame, a key suspended in air, a figure standing outside the walls of a city, yet casting a shadow longer than its towers. These images surfaced in manuscripts from far regions, and though scholars argued over their meaning, those within the silent room recognized a pattern they could no longer dismiss. It was not coincidence, but alignment. Threads weaving toward a single destiny. One fragment carried the most weight. It came from a parchment linked to the 1st century, where an unnamed writer claimed to have preserved a saying of Yeshua not recorded elsewhere. The words were stark and unsettling. One shall come who carries no crown, yet unsettles every throne. Their silence will speak louder than the voices of kings. Whether true or forged, the phrase had haunted generations of guardians who feared that when this figure appeared, all structures built after Yeshua would tremble. The president's advisors, though kept in ignorance of the deeper meanings, sensed the unease pressing through the redacted lines. They could not explain why leaders from the past had preserved such words, nor why their release came now. What they did know was that the question was no longer theological alone, but political. For prophecy in the hands of rulers becomes strategy, and strategy in the absence of understanding becomes fear. The crossroads described in the fragments is not distant. The signs described match the world that unfolds now, where silence carries more power than speech and unseen figures shift the direction of nations. And still the file refuses to reveal the name, leaving those who seek it suspended in the space between recognition and denial. The deeper the file was examined, the more it seemed to circle around a single theme, carefully obscured, yet never erased entirely. In marginal notes, faint lines reference not only the legacy of Yeshua, but the possibility of his return in ways not bound to doctrine or the expectations of churches. The whispers were not of a second coming in the form people had been taught to await, but of a presence that would carry his essence forward, embodied not in thunder from the skies, but in one who walked unnoticed among the living. These passages, half faded and marked by trembling handwriting, suggested that Yeshua had foreseen not just his own path, but the continuation of it through another. For some within the Vatican, these fragments bordered on heresy, for they threatened to dissolve the boundaries that had long separated the sacred from the ordinary. Yet others believed the words too precise to be dismissed. The notion that Yeshua had woven into time a reflection of himself unsettled the council that guarded the file. They could not decide whether this presence would serve as a comfort or a disruption. The fragment most troubling to them read, "He shall not return as he was, but as the echo that awakens in another, bearing the same fire in unfamiliar flesh." The president, unaware of this particular line, only sensed the unease radiating from those who stood closest to the Vatican. Advisors noted that communications from Rome had grown strained, as though officials feared that to speak openly would draw the very force they sought to contain. The whispers moved in corridors like shadows, carrying with them the possibility that the world was not simply waiting for prophecy to be fulfilled, but was already standing inside its unfolding. What haunted those who studied the file was not only the suggestion of Yeshua's essence carried forward, but the timing. The documents described signs of his nearness, signs that matched the age now rising, wars and confusion, knowledge without wisdom, and leaders searching for power in places they could not control. If the fragments were to be trusted, then the presence of the unknown one was not a distant hope or fear. It was already here, walking silently while the world remained unaware of what had arrived among them. Long before the file appeared in the Oval Office, there were those who already knew of its existence. Men and women who moved in the background of governments and councils, never stepping into the light yet shaping the course of decisions. They are sometimes called the Watchers, not because they intervene openly, but because their role has always been to observe, record, and wait for the moment when knowledge hidden from the world must be acted upon. The Vatican did not fully control them, nor did any government, for their allegiance was not to nation or creed, but to the preservation of a thread of history that few believed was real. The Watchers are said to have preserved documents when libraries burned, to have carried relics across continents when empires fell, and to have hidden names in code when rulers demanded erasure. In whispers, it is claimed they have followed a single line through centuries, ensuring that even as dynasties collapsed, the knowledge of a presence tied to prophecy could not be lost. Their influence is subtle, almost invisible. Yet when a name appears where it should not, when a figure rises outside the systems of power, they are always nearby, watching in silence. The file that unsettled the president bore traces of their hand. Some annotations in the margins match the script found in older codices preserved only in the Vatican's deepest vaults. The handwriting, though centuries apart, was the same. Scholars debated whether it was a coincidence, but those who knew of the Watchers understood otherwise. Their presence was not bound by time in ordinary ways. They carried continuity, as if it were a mantle, ensuring that the warnings of one age became the questions of the next. Among their preserved fragments was a troubling phrase tied to Yeshua himself. Not all who walk with him would pass away. Some would remain until what was promised unfolded. The Watchers guarded this line with reverence, interpreting it not as myth, but as mandate. To them, history was not a closed record, but a living process, and the file given to the president was only one step in a design still unraveling. The file was never meant to give answers, only to ignite questions. and by the time its pages had been studied in silence by those who held authority, it became clear that the truth it guarded could not be contained in ink and parchment. The redacted lines were not merely omissions, but boundaries, barriers placed to keep the reader from seeing too far, too quickly. Yet those who stared at its fragments long enough began to realize that identity cannot be confined to what was written. What mattered most was not in the file at all, but in the presence of the one it described. The president sensed this as he closed the folder late one night. The words, "Unknown One," echoing louder in his mind than any briefing his advisors had given him. He wondered if the Vatican had truly given him everything, or if what lay in his hands was only a shadow of a larger truth. More troubling still was the feeling that someone else was already moving beyond the reach of these records, someone not defined by the names and codes the file tried to conceal. The unease was not about the past, but about the unfolding present. Within the Vatican, silence deepened. Those who had once debated the fragments began to retreat into secrecy, as if acknowledging that the file had done its work. What could not be spoken in their halls was beginning to manifest outside them. If the one referenced in the margins of prophecy truly existed, then no archive, no government, no sealed chamber could control what was about to emerge. The Guardians had done their part, preserving fragments, but the living presence would now define itself in ways no redaction could prevent. Among the remaining whispers, one phrase stood out, attributed to Yeshua, yet absent from every gospel known to the public. The record of men cannot bind the record of heaven. The line suggested that the identity hidden across centuries was never meant to be revealed through paper and ink, but through encounter, through recognition by those with eyes to see. If that was true, then the file was only a shadow of the truth, a veil meant to delay, but not to deny. And somewhere, even as the president sat in silence and the Vatican kept its doors closed, the figure at the center of the mystery was already walking, unnamed, unclaimed, yet carrying the weight of revelation.
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.